this.
Well, when I first went back to, can you hear me? Okay. When I first went back to MIT, this was quite providential. I was in a graduate student dorm, and down the hall came an Indian guy who invited me to Park Street Church in Boston. Boston has this old historic church right in the middle of downtown Boston, and it was where the first missionaries were sent from America to the Hawaiian Islands. I wonder what that connection is, now that I think about it. But they sent the first missionaries, and over the years, Park Street Church had developed an amazing missions program in the church. And they had, if you can believe it, they had a 10-day missions conference every year. 10 days long, and it would be from morning till night. They would bring in missionaries, mission reps, and just describe what God was doing all over the place with these missionaries. I got into the graduate student group there, and there was a guy who was leading this collegiate ministry and graduate student ministry that was being discipled by a guy in Pasadena at Lake Avenue Church. These were sister churches. And there was a very strong discipleship program that was taking place in this group. If you can imagine, we all had this same version of the Bible, and we all were in the same passage every week. And we were so hungry. This was the early 70s. All across the U.S., it seemed like there was just an amazing hunger. It was just like a revival in us on the campuses with wanting to share Christ and to study the Word. And so we were all in the same passage every week, and we would come together on Sundays, and we would share what we were getting out of the Word together. And this really whet the appetite in my own heart for the Word. Plus, the pastor at the church, every Sunday, it was just expository preaching through the Bible, book after book after book. And I found myself so hungry for the Word because of what I was hearing as it was being preached faithfully week after week after week. So you wed the Word within the exposure to that missions at the end of a 10-day missions conference. Excuse me. At the end of one of these conferences in 1973, and the pastor always did this at the end of the conference, he would challenge everybody in the congregation, anyone willing to go anywhere for the sake of the gospel, to stand up. And I just felt a compulsion one day to stand up. And I stood up. And from that point on, it just seems like God started opening doors. The pastor said, why don't you become... Well, no. What happened during that, when I stood up, that same day, at one of the mission booths where Wycliffe Bible translators had reps, I had been often visiting that booth and talking to this guy, and at the very end of the conference, he shook my hand when the last time I was talking with him, and in his hand he had a $50 bill. And that was quite a bit of money in those days. But he shook my hand, and he said, Bruce, I believe the Lord wants you to get training to be a missionary. And that really stuck in my heart. So when I stood up, it happened also that the pastor, knowing my desire to be willing, and the gospel was just burning inside my heart. I can remember I was working in the Draper Research Lab where they were doing the Apollo testing for the inertial guidance systems. inertial guidance system testing for the Apollo flights. And I found myself in that laboratory at lunchtime just feeling kind of a compulsion to share Christ with the other engineers that were in there, just because of what I kept hearing from church and what I was getting out of the Word. And so these things kind of gelled. And the pastor said, Bruce, why don't you go off to Gordon Conwell Seminary for 1 year and just see what God does before taking a job with NASA. So I did, and felt very strong affirmation during that year. I was really like a fish out of water, because going from engineering into seminary, it was very strange world, seminary, in comparison to the engineering. You know, we would study 2 or 3 pages to derive a theorem of something, and seminary, you go in there, you got to read, you know, a whole book on something. And I was really just feeling like a fish out of water. But I went a second year, a third year, and then we got linked to Dr. Ralph Winter and the whole effort at the U.S. Center for World Mission and the establishment of this campus. And we had a training program called the Perspectives on the World Christian Movement course, which was kind of giving people a foundation for missions. And then we started taking some of the alumni from that training program to India. My wife and I took them to India, and we started getting them immersed in India. And so that's how we got linked then long-term to India. So that's how it happened with me. It was just like a divergence took place when I made a commitment, and God just seemed to open the way, open the way, open the way, and I just kept going. Didn't realize how drastic a decision I was really making at the time. It was just a little bit. Take a step of obedience. Take a step of obedience. See where it leads. And I've never felt a compulsion to go back. So that's how it happened with me. It's still happening with me. Yes? It was all in India. We went to South India when India first opened up with a 5-year visa in 1992. So we were there for 5 years. Then we got in for another 7 years up into North India on a different visa. Then all my kids graduated from that international school, and we felt it was time to come back because Dr. Winter was dying, and I spent very close time with him for 15 years. And he was just asking us to come back and to help with the transition of leadership. So. Okay? All right. Well, let's look a little bit now at the book of Esther. And again, to highlight, I found the slide I was looking for. This is some of the patterns of parallel text in the scriptures. It's called Hebrew parallelism, meaning Hebrews love to put 2 ideas together. You know, in Proverbs, you can have one phrase and then a second phrase, and that second phrase sometimes is re-emphasizing the first phrase. Sometimes it's the opposite of the first phrase. And when you put 2 ideas together that are either, if they're similar, you get a better idea of what it means. If it's opposite, you can also get a good idea of what it means. Sometimes they'll put 3 ideas together and they just grow. You got the first idea, and then the second idea, and the third idea, and it just keeps growing. The Lord did this. He did this and this. He did this, this, and this. Now, in that kind of a parallelism, the emphasis is on the third one. Okay? This one here. That is the key point the author is trying to make. Or in this kind of parallelism, you've got a part to the story that is parallel, or it's like this part to the story. This part is like this part. so forth, see? The turning point is a very key part to the story. Now, I said, like the Abraham story, here's the Abraham story. There are 7 parts. If you were to go through the story and say, where are the natural parts in this story, you would go and you would break it down. If you did this line and broke it down like this, okay, here's part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then you find, if it keeps going, the next part is like the 6th part. This part is like the 5th part, and so forth, see? Here in the Abraham story, you've got the opening commission, Genesis 12, 1 through 5. God is blessing to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth, right? That's his destiny of his descendants. Then you find he goes to the land, builds altar, he faces famine, goes into Egypt, separation from Lot, warfare with the descendants in the land, and then God comes to make covenant with him. And at the very center of the story, you have the story of this struggle between Sarah and Hagar. And God says, I'm going to fulfill my promise to you through Sarah. Now, the center of the story is showing you how he's going to fulfill this opening destiny. He's going to fulfill it through Sarah. The story is disclosing the means for the fulfillment of the promise. And at the end of the story, he's to go to Mount Moriah. It's just like the call when he called him to leave his own people and go to the land. Now he's called to take his son and go to Mount Moriah. See the parallelism in the theme? And on the Mount Moriah, you find God making fulfillment of the promise through the substitute lamb for the sacrifice that was being called for. And it's disclosing the true sacrifice that God is going to bring and make provision for to fulfill the promise to Abraham. You follow me? Yeah. This emphasizes the center of the story. So there's a pattern, see? You can get at the heart of the story when you recognize the pattern. Now, we're going to get into the story of Esther, but there's another story, and I think the Esther story is actually patterned almost after the story of Ruth. Interesting. The story of Ruth, a woman, and the amazing thing that God was doing to fulfill the purpose that he had promised Abraham through Ruth. And if you were to divide up the story of Ruth this way, you find there's 3 parts, and then the story begins to reverse itself, and you've got 3 more parts. Within this part, you've got the idea here, and I summarize it with this little phrase, Naomi's house is emptied. She loses everything. When you go through the story, you find at the very end, her house is filled. And it's filled with something far greater than what she was emptied of. There's a parallel between the opening and the conclusion. The second part has to do with commitment and witness. And there's 2 parts. Now, each one ends with this little so. There's the indication that you've come to a conclusion of a little unit. And a little unit. Now I just put these, there's 2 units in this section. In this section, there's 3 units. And then there's a great turning point in the story right here. Notice they all end with so, 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 so. This one doesn't have a so, but it ends. So, so, so forth. This part has 3, and it's interesting. This part is just like this. This is just like this. This is just like this. This part is like this. This part is related to this part. This is all about food, and you get to a turning point, and it becomes fulfilled in a husband. And there's relationship between the blessing of food and the blessing of a husband. So there's pattern here. Now, if you come to the Esther story, I just started studying this just this last week. I'm very, very intrigued with the story. I don't think I've fully arrived yet. But it's amazing when you read this story, it has almost the same pattern. Because I broke it down into these units. Now you go through the story and break it down how you think. It's interesting. Almost everyone, you know, in the Bible sometimes you have, okay, you have a little subheading that the translators have put in. Sometimes you want to just forget all those things and ask yourself, where is the unit of thought? Because sometimes that's not the unit. Okay? But interestingly, almost every chapter is a new unit in this book. It seems like it's broken down. You got chapter 10:1, 9:1, 8:1, 7:1, 6:1, 5, 4, 3. Now this one, it's a little bit different right here. But those seem to be the natural units. Something else I noticed. Each one seems to have an indication of a time. You'll notice this in the text when it starts this little unit. Sometime later. That's an indication, another part to the story. Then, here this little unit says, at that time. In other words, this unit is to be understood with this one. See, at the same time. Then this one, sometime later. See, a new unit. Then this one, at the same time. Then this one, 3 days later. And then that same night. While discussing this, that same day. So forth, see? The end of the story is all about a public holiday and a great festival and a decree that is made. It sounds just like the beginning of the story. If you were to put these two parts together, there's a great decree that is made and a declaration of a public holiday. It ends with something about Mordecai, and then you've got this little part here that's all about Mordecai. So I'm beginning to think that this part to the story, right here, is completely being reversed by this part to the story. There's a great reversal that is taking place here. Then you have this part to the story, and it ends with a law sent out, a public declaration. And this is like this part to the story. A law is sent out to reverse it. So this part to the story, and I include now both of these, is summarized in part A and part B in this. And then this part to the story is all being reversed in this part to the story. And where is the center of the story? Right here. If I was to say what is key about the whole book of Esther, it would be what's being highlighted right here. Let's look at it for a minute. Esther chapter 6, verse 1, just to prompt your thinking. Now, the flow to the story again, you've got the opening thing that shows corrupt leadership wanting to bring Vashti in to admire her beauty. I think there's some scholars that would actually say, and she was to wear her royal crown, but maybe she was wearing nothing else. Some scholars think. I don't know. It's possible. That's why she didn't want to come. And so the king gets greatly disturbed by that. All the wise men are brought in to make judgment on this, and they send out a decree to make sure that no woman will ever stand up to a husband in this way. And what does that say to you? Is that righteous judgment? I don't think so. I think this is human means to try to bring about submission. It's man-made decree. And then comes the idea of replacing her. And here comes Esther into the story, and she's given the royal crown and a great feast. And in the book of Esther, you've got to understand what's happening in the context of festival. Because in the feast, there is a celebration, and that celebration is very key to what's at the heart of the story. And there's a public declaration when Esther is chosen. Now, Mordecai comes into the scene, and he is a servant at the gate of the king. It's kind of interesting who serves at the gate. He's a gatekeeper to the king. He protects the king. And as you know, he hears about a plot to kill the king, and he exposes it, and that becomes a record written in the royal records. So the plot thickens, and the story keeps moving. Now the king honors Haman, and Haman, because Mordecai does not bow down to him, and there's a theme to pick up on. How is submission being brought about in these stories? And what happens when somebody does not submit? And the anger that arises in Haman and so forth when this doesn't occur in relationship to Mordecai. So they send out a law and a decree. Then Mordecai goes out and weeps and informs Esther. And Esther and her response to go in before the king is risking her life in order to make something known. Here is sacrifice. She's willing to become a holy sacrifice in relationship to what is true and right and just. The king welcomes her, and then comes this center to the story, and just ponder what happens now. That same night, the king simply couldn't sleep. He had the official royal records brought in, and his young male servants began reading them to the king. To have the official royal records brought in, and they disclose a man who sought to save the king, Mordecai. There's something very, very significant, I think, in this, because in the royal record, this book, there is revelation of one who's coming to save. And I think it can almost carry this broad of a significance, that in these royal records, and we're reading them in this book, this is what is written in these royal records. And it discloses things that God is going to use to bring about the fulfillment of his purpose. There were two, he began to read them, and they came to the report about Mordecai, informing on Bigthan and Teresh. They were the two royal eunuchs among the guards protecting the king's doorway, who secretly planned to kill the king. What was done to honor and reward Mordecai for this, the king asked. And then, as you know, when he asked that question, and here's the sovereign situation that we see, there comes Haman into the courtyard of the king right at that moment. And you see an amazing orchestration of God of how he's going to begin to reverse everything. And you read on what happens. From this point on in the story, the whole situation begins to get reversed and undone, and it becomes a festival and a feast at the end that will celebrate for all future generations what God has for the Jewish people in relationship to the nations of the earth. It's an amazing thing. This thing gets down to, and you find in the text it keeps saying that Esther's identity as a Jew was not disclosed. Mordecai didn't say he was a Jew, but then all of a sudden it begins to be known that he's a Jew. Now that keeps emphasizing and prompting you to realize, this is very, very important. The idea that this guy has Jewish background. It says that at the end of that thing, when Haman finds out that the king wants to honor Mordecai and do everything that he was hoping was going to be given to him, he goes home and he sulks. And he gets his wife and he gets his friends and he starts talking about how great he is. Did you remember this in the story? And then notice what is said by his friends and wife. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Both his friends and his wife said to him, "You've already begun to lose out to Mordecai. If he is of Jewish birth, you'll not be able to win against him. You are surely going to lose out to him. You will not overcome him." See? Now that is a great point of reversal, and it has to do with the Jewish people and what God is going to bring about in terms of fulfillment. And the restoration has to do with rulership. There's going to be great rulership that's going to emerge in the midst of this. So that's a great turning point. Then you find the rest of the story and just look at it. Keep going back and saying what gets reversed. Now, here are the types of questions that came to my mind as I was going through this. And here's what you could do to practice as you ponder a story like this. Keep asking, what are the questions that begin to arise? Here are the questions that came to me. What relationships do you see between the parts in this story? Because one part gets reversed in another part. So look at those two parts. What's parallel between them? Okay. What kind of reversals take place? What is reversed is very significant in the story. What do you think is the major turning point? Well, I just highlighted it. But maybe you have some other idea. What message is being communicated through that turning? Okay. These kinds of questions. Now, when you get into interpretation, usually we always want to start thinking about any one particular story in light of the grand story of the Bible. How does this contribute to the grand story of the Bible? I think the book of Esther is showing an amazing picture of Jews out among Gentiles in Babylon and how God is still watching over them to bring about his purpose through them in relationship to the nations. And interestingly, it's through a woman. Through a woman. How significant women have been in stewarding the fulfillment of God's purpose. Sarah, Rachel, barren. Ruth, a Moabite, Gentile. And she stewarded the promise. Here's Esther in her day. And she's stewarding the fulfillment of this promise. So how does this story contribute to the grand story of the Bible? What do you think is the main revelation in the whole story? Well, in the story here, I would say, when you think about the center of this story with the conclusion and the festivals and the proclamation and decree that is made, and it's to be celebrated every year among the Jews for all future generations, in that celebration, and it's the feast of Purim. What is the message in that festival that is to be celebrated every generation? And Jews still celebrate it today. It's a message to all the nations of the earth of what God intends. So ponder the meaning of this festival here. Okay, then how does this story begin to move your own heart? If you were to put yourself in Esther's shoes, or Mordecai's shoes, or put yourself in the shoes of the king, what would move your heart? What do you learn about Esther in stewarding what God is doing in you? Like Esther, or like Mordecai, teaches us a lot about integrity, courage, sacrifice. And it's through those means that God really does amazing things in corrupt situations, like Esther has found herself in. Okay, what leadership traits then in the characters in this story could you emulate or avoid? Could you follow or could you avoid? Here's another question. What kind of heart makes a good leader? I think you can find that in this story. What makes a good leader? You got illustrations of what makes bad leaders, and you got an illustration of what makes good leaders in this story. And what can you glean out of it in both those areas? Okay? Now, I don't know how you guys process things here, but why don't you, if I might ask, if this would be helpful to you, two people turn around to the two that are behind you on each desk, so that you have groups of 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, okay? And just ask yourself, share together, what is intriguing about this story that you want to pursue more? What are questions that are coming to your mind that you want to try to find the answer to? What is getting stirred in your own heart? Can you just share that with each other to kind of just prime the pump? And then we'll come back together in a few minutes, okay? And raise any questions that you have, or if you've got questions about how to study inductively, we can discuss that also. But why don't you turn around and do that for a few minutes.